And yeah, so next we have Stacey Mosley, who is the founder and CEO of Stepwise Analytics and the director of research at Brandywine Realty Trust. She's going to walk us through the Philly startup scene and different pathways for data science. So again, just a reminder, keep yourselves muted and turn off your video. And if you have any questions throughout the talk, feel free to post them in the chat and we can talk about them at the end. So Stacey, whenever you're ready.
Hi, hello everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I am very excited to be here, and I think that it's just very refreshing to see so many people dialed in right now. I know it's the very tail end of the day, and I'm sure you've been hearing lots of interesting stuff. This last talk was fascinating, and I think some of the key terms, even just coming out of that, of being able to tell a story with information and seeing it through the context of sports is really cool. So yes, I am here today to talk a little bit more about my own journey and some of the tools and lessons that I've learned along the way. And so I am going to dive in. All right. All right. Can folks see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you again. As was mentioned, my name is Stacey Mosley, and I come from the Philadelphia area in general. I grew up just outside the city, and I went to college out in Chicago at Northwestern University, but came right back pretty much really wanting to take root here in this area, very proximate to both New York and Washington, D.C., and really appreciative of that effect. So after graduating, for folks who are a little bit more into pop culture, I was very uncertain what to do with myself. My background in going to college was manufacturing and design engineering, which really was a product of me just loving to solve problems and trying to find a very nebulous way, in a sense, of having a wide scope of problems that I could choose to try my hand at, and knowing all of these engineering techniques and mathematical techniques to then try and solve them. And so the manufacturing and design engineering program was actually a really interesting mix of kind of the creative parts of product design with the more quantitative rigor of industrial engineering. So my first introduction to data and coding was very much through the sense of trying to understand operational efficiencies. So if you have a production line, how fine-tuned are the machines? How well does the end product actually support your end goals? And using data and all sorts of mathematical techniques to start to really identify where the weaknesses were or how to optimize them. And that kind of led me into some more programmatic languages like MATLAB, which is a heavily engineering focused language, but really giving that kind of entree into being able to take large data sets, large matrices of information, and try to synthesize insights from them. So with that, I was a little bit perplexed, as I said, and not really knowing how I wanted to apply all of that knowledge after college. I left and came back to Philly, where I started working at a company called Ticketleap, which I believe is still in existence today. But a little bit of a backstory to that era. So this was 2009, and basically the Great Recession had just hit. So I'm living through my second kind of economic downfall period right now with the pandemic, but kind of right out of the gate from college was faced, as I'm sure many of you were also, with the recession. And what was starting to bubble up at the time was kind of the beginnings of the Philly tech scene. So there were a number of millennials who had kind of found themselves in a very similar situation, and there were a few folks who were actually probably 5 or 6 years ahead of us that had started trying to found small companies and get the seed capital, the Series A capital to actually do so and grow those businesses. And that's something that I will certainly get into in more detail in talking about my own startup. But there really, in like 2009, was only a tiny little cluster of people who were kind of supporting each other and trying to start an ecosystem of sorts. And so Ticket Leap was one of the few during the recession, especially, that was hanging on. They were growing at the time, and over the course of my tenure there, which was summer of 2009 to summer of 2010, they pretty much doubled in headcount, which was rare for startups at that time. They went from about 20 people to upwards of 45. And then, of course, we had all sorts of troubles, and that staffing had to be cut significantly back in half. And they cut me and 20 other folks along with it, which is just kind of a function of the risk that you take in getting involved in a tiny company. So startups are very much a roller coaster ride. They have their very highs and their very lows. And it kind of is par for the course to know that there is a high chance that if you're getting in on the early stages, the company may not work out. So when I was there, I had a real focus on product development. So kind of translating that kind of physical goods focus from my college days into more of a technical focus, because I knew that technologies and emerging technologies were really going to revolutionize all industries. And even though I wasn't super excited about ticket sales in particular, it was still just a way for me to kind of get my foot in the door and see things from that kind of small company level, where you can really get to know most of the people on the team, and in that way understand how it kind of operates as an organism. So my work there on the product side was interesting at the time, because we had a system that was essentially coded by an offshore team in India several years before I even got there. I think when I was hired as employee 23, it was 4 or 5 years into the company's existence. So this code was aging, and as the company was growing rapidly and getting all sorts of new requests and finding new opportunities for audiences and users, they were kind of building on top of garbage, on top of garbage, on top of garbage, until it got to a point where everything was starting to break. And it was interesting at the time to see them bring in a whole bunch of consultants to start trying to unwind what they called spaghetti code. And it turned out that it needed to be completely rewritten. And in the process of that, they had to create a whole new data architecture. And I was really interested in what that even meant. I had never worked for another company before, and especially a technical company. So trying to start understanding the relationship between, okay, there's going to be this front end system with all of this user activity, but then there's going to be this back end behind the scenes where all of this information really needs to be structured in a really clean way, so that we can anticipate changes moving forward and have it really be in a good place to accommodate all of that change. So I was really curious about it, but actually members of the team were like, no, you don't need to know about this. You don't need to understand that. And I was like, okay. But even with that kind of wall being put up, and even shortly thereafter being laid off, I was really interested in starting to leverage data to solve more interesting things that were of more interest to me, at least. And so with it being a recession, I ended up trying to see what a safe move would be. And that kind of thinking led me to working for the city of Philadelphia. So in 2010, I I certainly had a few months in between those two where I was trying to figure out what I actually wanted to do with my career, what I wanted to really focus on in terms of a product. And I ended up becoming really interested in all of the economic issues and vacancy challenges that this city suffers from. So for folks who, I imagine almost all of you have been downtown, let alone in other parts of the city, there's a very high contrast between places like North Philadelphia and even Northern Liberties at this point. You have very, very disinvested neighborhoods where over generations there's just nobody there to even maintain homes that were built several decades ago, and over time they've collapsed and they've crumbled, and the city has had to take down tens of thousands of those vacant buildings. And when you get into the order of magnitude of tens of thousands of anything with a problem, it becomes a really interesting data challenge. And so that's what I really ended up diving into there. So in my time at the city, I started learning SQL, which is now my dominant language, and starting to really play with combining information from several different data silos, like the revenue department and the building department and Office of Property Assessments and tax information. So starting to try and find signals wherever I could to better understand the dynamics of what I was interpreting, to understand the dynamics of the economy, essentially locally. And I think that's one of the things that really interests me about data science in general. Is it's this very independent exercise in a way of asking questions and having the ability to get answers, and in many times just having more questions arise even with the ones where you started. And so I think that kind of question and answer, and the idea that there must be some pattern, there must be some absolute, and in many times there are not. But it's one of those things that always fulfilled me about math and science in general, was being able to know what your question was, develop those scientific questions, and use the information at your hands to arrive at an answer. So kind of along the way in that journey, I got really into data science, leveraging geospatial information in QGIS and ArcGIS, and also in R. And that was very fulfilling. But one of the things that it taught me was you can do the work and you can arrive at the insights, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have the authority to do anything with them. So even if you're trying to solve the problem, you may not have the ability to actually change the behavior that's creating the problem in the first place. And that's certainly something that, as a relatively young person, working for a very, very bureaucratic organization like the city, was extremely challenging for me to realize. And I got all feisty. and decided to leave and start my own company, which was Stepwise. So using all of this information that I had at my fingertips from the city, I started trying to arrive at a way for um, the private market to address the same issues of blight that I wasn't able to kind of make a dent in from the city side. So sure, at the city, I could analyze the heck out of that information and share with the building department how their pipeline of vacancy cases in court might be backed up, and it might be because of this, that, or the other thing, or share with the inspectors that maybe we should group together inspecting all of these properties because they're by a certain owner. Don't just go out to everybody's individual requests that are scattered all over the place. That was great, but it wasn't really making the kind of impact that I wanted to have. And so with Stepwise, I started creating a user interface where I could surface which properties that were in this kind of dilapidated condition would be ripe for redevelopment. So using the signals in the building data and otherwise to really flag which ones were kind of on the fringes and economically does it make sense. So I worked independently for quite a long time with whatever powers I had, along with my good friend who became my co-founder, to build an application that was self-service. Because at the time, thinking about the startup community, I was like, SaaS must be the answer. And of course, it was not. Which is why I now work for Brandywine Realty Trust. But Stepwise itself was a huge journey for me, because in terms of the startup community, I certainly got to know much more about the investment community, the organizations like Ben Franklin Technology Partners, what resources they have, what they choose to invest in and why, and also the challenges that we face as a city in really attracting more capital. But it also led me to a better understanding, for better or worse, around the nature of industries that do not yet have data really pushing the agenda forward. And real estate is very much one of those very traditional industries that has a lot of individuals who just think that they know how it works. They've been doing it for decades. They know their markets. What you have to offer with your data and your analytics isn't going to matter to them. They already know whatever you're going to tell them. And that is, quite frankly, for all of us, as we know data, a load of crap. There's always something new to learn, and there are absolutely different patterns to discover things. But I think what really propelled me into real estate even more, which upfront was kind of my my barrier to entry and my greatest challenge in trying to get my company off the ground, has now become my way of really understanding and learning the industry backwards and forwards as well as I can get my hands on whatever information there is to be had about it. So, for example, in trying to sell Stepwise, so data as a service, having a Zillow-like platform where you can filter and identify and get all sorts of predictive models and market studies about different assets, it was really, really hard to sell. So like, even if you have the answers, just like I experienced at the city, it was, I didn't have the authority to change things. At Stepwise, even if I had really good answers and really solid insights, it didn't necessarily mean that people bought into the idea that they were right. And so that kind of led us down a really challenging path of realizing we almost needed to be more like a real estate company if we were going to eventually succeed, that was then driven by analytics as opposed to an analytics company that could help drive real estate. So we didn't make it in time. We ran out of money, and even though I had raised a small bundle of money in 2018 and was able to hire a data engineer and an infrastructure engineer in addition to my co-founder, who was very much a front-end developer, it was too late. We had gone through it all, and I had to step back. And I think that was extremely difficult, and especially being an analytically minded person, I constantly was trying to figure out why and what I could have done better. But I think, quite frankly, we were too early, and we hadn't raised enough money. It's a very hard thing to do in this town, and we didn't have the full set of people. We didn't have a sales and marketing person. I had clearly prioritized product with all of the engineering folks in mind, and it was extremely challenging. But so with Brandywine now, I have the ability to learn so much more than I even expected. So Brandywine Realty Trust, for those who may not be familiar, is a $5 million publicly traded company that owns a significant number of office buildings in the city, which office right now is certainly an evolving animal, which I'm learning a lot about through data. But they own the Sears Center out by Amtrak. They or the 30th Street Station. They own the beautiful FMC Tower. That's actually where I work, and several other buildings across the city, as well as Washington, D.C. and in Austin, Texas. And so now, looking at pandemic times, where I was learning so much about the residential community through the city of Philadelphia work and through my own company at Stepwise, now I'm using data to understand when people are planning on returning to work. What is that actually going to mean? What does that start looking like? There's all sorts of tenant survey information. There's all sorts of building scan information. So people swiping in and taking the elevator. There's all sorts of economic data about the labor market and which businesses are hiring and which ones are raising money. And so I'm getting to leverage a significant amount of that in a totally different way to better understand the economy. And kind of my overarching thing, which I'll get into at the tail end again, is data and that kind of mindset, that analytical mindset. It really is just a bunch of superpowers that gives you the ability to understand whatever industry or industries you really want to. Like, you can find your way, and the path kind of starts presenting itself, as I mentioned, because you ask questions and you figure out answers and you figure out patterns, but then you keep asking questions, and it leads to more knowledge and more insight and more understanding about that corner of the universe that you're really kind of devoting yourself to, in a way, and in a way that's far more detailed sometimes, and quicker to arrive at than many other people will experience. So this here is a visual that I really got excited about, because I think this kind of speaks in many ways to how products are designed with the end goal at the center of having like a really great user experience. And that might be a technical product, that might be a process, that might be how Brandywine sells and leases office space. And all of the concentric circles and all of the overlap in the Venn diagram kind of lay out these different pieces that contribute to what that experience is like. Because at the end of the day, whatever data you're looking at most of the time is a reflection of an event or an experience that somebody is having. There's some activity happening, or there's some input that's taking place that you're able to then gather and look at a macro level. And so looking at some of the corners of the spectrum, you can see there are going to be those much more technical roles that are both kind of looking at how to design systems to collect information, or how to design systems on the lower right side, how to design them to share that information back. So how does it need to be visually translated back to a user who's then going to interpret or be entering information? And then there's certainly the business case, which is just trying to understand, why are you even building it in the first place? What is even happening on the other end? So for all of the data that you are collecting, what are you learning from that? And so this to me kind of becomes a little bit of a map of where some of the variety of different roles in the data community really can fall, because you certainly have database administrators that are much more in the green, and you have data engineers that are kind of moving in this green and red space. But then you also have really amazing visual designers with how that data is then displayed, that fall much more into the blue and the red. And so kind of the same way that I was talking about how you can kind of choose your own adventure using data as your superpowers, you can really do that within an organization through these very specific realms of an operation itself. And so this is just kind of a reflection of how messy that can really get when it means trying to find an actual job. I, quite frankly, have been fortunate in one way or another to kind of make up my own title along the way. And I think a large part of that, again, is because the city of Philadelphia and the real estate industry have been very new to data and what it means to their organization. But from this, you can clearly see that, of course, like data analysts and data scientists have really become the most familiar terms and the most needed specialists in many ways. And so this kind of gives you that broader spectrum, knowing that there are going to be titles that are actually very much synonymous with those other two. And it's kind of an interesting thing where organizations may not know exactly what they need. And so sometimes it's kind of buried in whatever title they've decided to give it. Even here where, you know, somebody's just looking for a coder. So yeah, to circle back to what I was saying before, this kind of journey, I mean, half of these titles I pretty much made up for myself along the way, because I knew what I wanted to accomplish in a way that the people that I was working for didn't even necessarily understand. And so getting to kind of drive that conversation, I've been very fortunate to do. And I bring up Billie Eilish just as a frame of reference, because it certainly has felt, even though it's been very challenging throughout my career, it certainly felt like being able to kind of just take a step back, look at all your actions, and kind of pluck up what you can where you want it, whether it's a donut or a pretzel. So lastly, this is more on the startup side of things, and kind of touches on a few different areas that are really starting to flourish throughout the city. Just one second. So you have RJ Metrics, Fishtown Analytics, Stitch. RJ Metrics is actually really amazing, and Crossbeam, this whole story here in this upper left quadrant are actually born out of Bob Moore and Jake Stein's work. So RJ Metrics was founded well over a decade ago and ended up selling, but in the process of doing so, split into Stitch. And some of the alumni founded Fishtown Analytics, which has now raised tens of millions of dollars. And Bob Moore has gone on to work on his next startup, Crossbeam. Guru, definitely one of my favorites. Rick Nucci is amazing and is doing really interesting things around customer service and knowledge-based technology. You have more geospatial work happening at the city and Xavia. And then in the upper right, certainly a number of foundations that do really interesting research like Pew, as well as investment companies like Vanguard, SEI, and the Reinvestment Fund. But lastly, I certainly wanted to highlight for folks who are interested in the life sciences, this is becoming a really hot and growing industry within the Philadelphia region and across the country, where you have gene therapy and cell therapy companies really taking off and needing a lot of data science to understand the results that are coming back. So with that, I didn't realize how much time had actually passed, and I don't know that we have much left for questions. So I sincerely apologize, but I will open up the floor. Let me see on the sheet. Okay.
Luckily, Stacey, since the next is just closing remarks, you can have another minute or two.
Awesome. So, how do you convince scientists and engineers to sacrifice large paychecks at multinational companies to join a startup? You really need to know your mission and be really passionate about it, because that's going to translate into the kind of energy that your team needs to bring to the table every day. And it actually is something that will just draw energy towards you a lot. So if you're really passionate about something, people are really going to be able to tell, and also they're going to be able to tell that you're really focused on accomplishing just that. So it takes a lot of belief in the idea and in the person really driving the startup. Does the Philly startup scene seem small or large when working in it? It is small but growing. And I think getting to know the people in the startup community makes a huge difference. That kind of cross mingling between people who work for much larger companies, as well as those who are trying to start something from scratch. There's definitely lessons to be learned on each side, because oftentimes the startup scene, they're going to be trying some really like nouveau things in technology that may not have backing yet. And you might find some really interesting chemistry between them, but it's still quite small here. And companies like Guru and Crossbeam, which are getting outside capital from New York City and San Francisco in large quantities, are really starting to shift a little bit of the focus. So I'm hopeful that it gets to be pretty large over the next like 20 years. Okay, and I will take one more. How do you manage your time efficiently to run your own company at the same time of being director at another company? So beautiful thing about technology is you can automate it. And so our self-service product it refreshes nightly, and it's not without having to address bugs every now and then. But fortunately, it kind of takes care of itself, which is really awesome. The data gets ingested, it runs through a bunch of transformation scripts, and then can be accessed in its newly created state each morning. So being able to be a little bit hands-free. Okay, and thank you again. I hope this was a bit of a refreshing end to what has probably been a really, really interesting day. and I really appreciate having the privilege to speak. So let me know, reach out to me, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Stacey. It's been really incredible hearing you speak and close up the day, hearing about different roles and just industries available related to data science and in the Philadelphia community. And your story is really interesting, all the different paths that you've taken. So thank you so much.